Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about a little controversy that came up around Twitch within Women's History Month and Women's History. I bit my tongue as I was saying that Women's History Month. Twitch around Women's History Month and being trans inclusive and the use of the word women spelt with an X. And this controversy came out of the fact that the word women might not be considered inclusive to many trans people. But I saw a lot of differing opinions on the use of the word, and actually some people who had differing views on where that word came from and why it was offensive. So I want to take this video to talk about the history of the word women, as well as the other word women with a Y, and talk about what the histories of these words, why they are offensive, and what lessons we can learn from this situation with Twitch, because I think that there are many different lessons to take out of this in terms of like how we talk about people who want to be inclusive but may not always get their wording right, or their how they enact their intention to be inclusive right, and how we actually create positive, constructive conversations coming out of that instead of negative ones. Now, right up front, to get into this conversation, I just have to be very, very clear, because we're going to be talking about the words women, and women. I am going to sort of say them a little bit differently just because I'm doing this video unscripted and my brain will explode if I constantly have to try and remember which one I'm using. So when I talk about women, the actual just word women that most of us use with an E, I'm going to just say women. When I use women with a Y, I'm going to say Wymyn. Just because that's what my brain is going to do. And then for women with an X, I'm going to call it Womxn? We're going to go with Womxn. I don't know. I'm trying to help my brain here. Just stick with me. Just roll with me. They're all pronounced women, but I'm just going to do that just for ease of understanding within this video and ease of my brain not going more bonkers than it already does. So let me start off this conversation with explaining what happened with Twitch. Twitch, because this is Women's History Month, decided to, release some statements for Women's History Month, but they decided to use the term Womxn, because they saw the term Womxn to be inclusive of trans people, saying like, look, we as a company wish to acknowledge Women's History Month, but we also wish to acknowledge trans people within that. So the sort of like correct thing to do is be to use this term to signal our desire to include trans people within our conversations. But a lot of people push back against the use of Womxn because they saw it as actually harmful to trans people and saw it as offensive to trans people and non-binary people as well. If you consider non-binary sort of a subset of trans people, or separately is its own other conversation, but it was sort of seen as harmful to those communities. How is this the case? How can we go from an intention that is good to include trans people to actually people saying like, no, you're not including trans people with this term? Well, that gets us into the etymology of the different words that I was talking about up front. Women obviously is a word that many people use to describe people who are female identified, who identify as women, as the girl gender. But way back during second wave feminism, many people brought up the fact that women ends with the word men, that it has the word men in it, and women felt uncomfortable at the time, feminists at the time, sort of pointed out the fact that like, women are not a subset of men, that women are a sort of distinct group from men and wanted to be identified as such. Now, we could go back into even further in the etymology that men, the word men was not necessarily a gendered term, but became gendered in our society. But coming out of the feminist roots, that was sort of the intention, to sort of pull away from women being sort of seen as sort of lesser than, or a sort of subset of man, or a sort of, sort of a secondary class to men, and sort of claiming an identity for their own. And so the word Wymyn, now I'm confusing myself. And so the word Wymyn was created to sort of say like, hey, we are, not sort of falling under the men label, but we are Wymyn. Now, this term became incredibly politicized, not only for its feminist angle, because people saw it as an attack against men, but also within feminist spaces themselves, because this term was created by a lot of upper-class feminists, many white feminists as well, who didn't necessarily discuss the intersectionality of many issues that face women. For example, how black women are sometimes more harmed for being black as well as being women, and also being black women as well on top of that, or necessarily how class affected that as well. Someone in the lower class does not face necessarily the same fights as women in the upper class, for example. But this word sort of ignored all of that. It also became even more charged when what we would consider to be TERFs today, they weren't called TERFs at the time, but trans exclusionary radical feminists. At the time, they were just sort of trans exclusionary feminists. They just were kind of known as people who didn't accept trans people, and we didn't even call them trans people at the time, transsexuals, kind of oversimplifying a lot of feminist history here. But a lot of what we would term to be TERFs today started using the term to say, like, trans women are not women, we're Womyn, and they're just something else. They're Womyn for Womyn, like Womyn-only spaces. And this term was used for many, many decades to intentionally exclude trans women from feminist spaces and communities. It was sort of directly targeted against those communities. So this term kind of became emblematic of what we would consider like white upper class feminism. Feminism that only focuses on the issues that face white upper class feminism and doesn't really look at the intersection of trans identities, racial identities, and class identities, and how that all is sort of falling under the feminist umbrella and affects women in different ways who fall in, different intersections of those identities. So that term became heavily politicized and was viewed very negatively outside of, white upper class feminist spaces for a bunch of different reasons. Jump forward a few decades, and many people decided to start using the term Wxmen. Wxmen? I even forgot what I was going to use. I'm going to call it Wxmen because women X-Men? Wxmen. We're going to go with Wxmen. But Wxmen came out of a desire to push directly against the use of Womyn. Many people wanted to say, like, hey, we accept all women of all stripes. And so Wxmen is going to include trans women, non-binary people, and people of color. On its face, you can understand the impetus, right? That term, Womyn, was not including these identities. It was expressly sort of implicitly or explicitly excluding these identities. So creating this other term to include that sort of feels like a natural, like, yeah, screw you, we're going to include these people. But it also creates its own problems because the word is coming out of the root of women, saying, we identify as women. Anybody who, is a woman is a woman. And so when you say, like, oh, Wxmen is including trans women and women of color, that's expressly sort of saying that, oh, these identities weren't included in the word women in general. You're sort of saying, like, oh, that you weren't really in women, so now we're going to include you now. It's sort of pushing it back against this idea that trans women were not always women, that we were men once. It's like, no, trans women are women, have always been women. We were just sort of assigned male at birth, but because gender is a social construct and we've taken steps to transition and things like that, we are women and we are seen as women. And that's a whole complicated topic, but to discuss this sort of social construct of gender. But for the most part, this term was excluding trans women. And the same thing for women of color. Women of color have always been women. They weren't excluded from the term women, even though they might have been excluded or not considered within the term Womyn. So to not include them in Wxmen, or to say that they were included in Wxmen, implies that they were never really women. And so while the intention of Wxmen was certainly much better than Womyn, it sort of has this sort of implicit bias or against these communities. Not only that, the added problem comes from the inclusion of non-binary people in this term, because non-binary people are not women. They don't wish to be seen as women. Even if they were assigned female at birth, non-binary people are their own distinct gender. So using a term using Wxmen, a term that is very similar to the term women, sort of like kind of genders them unintentionally in a way that they do not wish to be gendered. So in many ways, the use of this word is really kind of harmful and problematic. So that's the sort of two distinguishers of these words. The intentions are very, very different with each word, and yet both words are kind of problematic, to overuse a sort of generalized term, in their own distinct ways and harm the same groups, but in two very different ways, even though one has sort of more harmful intentions, one has more altruistic intentions. And so this brings us back to Twitch, because I want to talk about intention when it comes to using these words. Twitch used the word Wxmen to be inclusive of trans people, and trans people and non-binary people and people of color rightly pointed out the fact that this word was offensive. And Twitch did the right thing and said, oh, we will fix this. We will change our term to be women. and we will say Women's History Month. We won't use Womxn in our discussions, which I think was the exact right response. Because I feel like often in these types of conversations, when someone makes a mistake like this, either in sort of like big corporate circles like this, or in small conversations one-on-one with people, if someone makes a small mistake, we always feel like, oh, those people are going to be attacked. Like, you make a small mistake, so you're going to be canceled, you're going to be hated on, we're going to despise you. But I think that while there were a lot of people that did jump on the let's hate on Twitch bandwagon, I feel like the conversation ended up being mostly productive. Twitch learned from its mistake, whether it was just an intern who made the mistake, someone who didn't do the research made the mistake. Clearly, it was all fixed and resolved. And I feel like this is a positive way forward. I feel like in conversations like this, we need to do our best to point out the problem, say that this is the problem, but allow the person to react and set the record straight as long as they do it in the right amount of time. If they don't respond to that, if they ignore the problems, then I feel like then there's a larger issue to be discussed. But I feel like we need to have these conversations and allow people to learn. And I think the way we do this and the way that we should the thing that we should let be our guiding star is always going to be intention. With the original creation of the word Womxn, the intention was to be good, wasn't to be inclusive. And unfortunately, the term was not, even though the intention was good. It was harmful. The intention was to be good, and so there are many people who may look at that and be like, "Oh yeah, I want to be inclusive. I want to include that term in our usage." They also may look at similar words like Latinx, which is a term coming out of the Hispanic community for non-binary people. There's Latino and Latina to describe boy and girl, and there's people who use Latinx to describe non-binary people. But that has a very different context within the Hispanic community than it does in the English-speaking community, when we don't have necessarily gendered terms in the same way that the Spanish community has. So it's very, very different. But I understand people looking at Latinx, seeing how it's generally, not always, and I can't speak for the Hispanic community on this, but from what I've seen, that term is generally more accepted by the non-binary community, say like, oh, that's the same as Womenx, right? And so someone who does not have trans people on their team, who may not include trans people in discussions, may look at that and be like, oh, we can use that. So Twitch's intention was to be inclusive, but they got it wrong. But then they listened and fixed it, and I think that is excellent. However, this does need to be backed up by Twitch continually doing better. What this means is that mistakes like this should not happen in the future from Twitch. This should mean that Twitch should do better about trying to include trans people, non-binary people, and people of color on their teams when making these decisions, and just include them on their teams in general. Moments like this should be used for a learning moment, but the learning moment can't just happen in the moment. It needs to be backed up by pushing things forward to do better, to learn more. That's why I do videos like this, because this whole controversy brought up this conversation about those different terms of the word women and the different histories of those words, and so now we're learning together. We should take it as this moment to learn, to teach, to grow, and you need to push that forward constantly instead of just being like, all right, we did the work. We're done now, right? We can all go home, right? There are groups though that use the term Womenx or Womxn. I can't even remember what I've been doing at this point. It's all so confusing. It's the term. Remember, it's still pronounced women. I'm just trying to use this for ease of discussion here. But who may use that term to intentionally be uninclusive, to intentionally attack trans people. I even saw some people after this controversy go online on Twitch and say like, well, this is a Womenx only space, to intentionally be sort of derogatory towards trans people, that they were sort of taking this as sort of a way to push back and make fun of trans people. And that intention is clearly intentionally bad. And so when you look at that intention, that's when I think we can be a little bit more, I don't want to say like we can harass, because I don't support any of that, but we can be a little bit more direct in our response to that person. It's like, no, that is unacceptable in that. But with someone like Twitch, where the intention was good, say like, hey, our tone should be a little bit more understandable and accepting of that. And ultimately, this leads me to the conversation that I really wanted to have, that I feel like in these types of situations, we often forget to look at intention in both directions, I should say. For example, with a company like Twitch, whose intention was to be good, we often get ready to get very angry about the situation and make fun, when we can use it as a learning moment. We can say, look, their intention was good, but they made a mistake that could be harmful. But at the end of the day, their intention was to be good, and this is not like a huge problem. It's just a single word. If this was something like more intentional, like even if their intention was good, but they were actively harming people, I would say, okay, there needs to be a much stronger conversation. But with something as simple as the misuse of a word that is very confusing, even within people and spaces who understand these issues, I think it's a chance for us to take it and make it a learning moment. However, we also need to be careful to always look at intention of people who are going to do this negatively. There are people who will take advantage of this gray area to make fun of trans people, to be intentionally exclusive and signal to others that, like, hey, wink, wink, we don't like these people either, but are allowed to say such things because there is this gray area. And so I think we need to be much more cognizant of looking at the nuance of a situation and saying, okay, what was this person's intention? Was their intention to be good, but just sort of misinformed or misguided or not entirely aware of the situation? Or was their intention to be cruel, to be mean, to be exclusionary, to be insulting? And I think that is what we should use to guide our interactions with these different sort of issues, or as opposed to having one size fits all response to something that's either too aggressive or too laissez-faire. So to finalize this conversation, the two things that I think we should learn is when we have these conversations, we should always look at someone's intention, but always make sure that we back up our look at intention with sort of trying to educate, to trying to learn, but also making sure that we hold the people that are doing the learning accountable, because now we know that they should have learned. And so if they make this mistake again, well, we can be a little bit less forgiving. All right, now that I'm done, hopefully I can figure out how to use the word women. Oh boy. Thank you so much, everybody. I'd love to know all your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you find my use of the different terms for the word women to be funny, to be problematic? Because I hope, by the way, I should say, if people did find the use of my different sort of what I find to be a little bit funny uses of those words offensive, I totally, I'm here to hear that criticism. I just was trying to ease the conversation, but I'd love to hear your comments on that too below, because I always want to hear critique on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more discussions like this. And also I have a Patreon page if you want to support me missaying words over and over and over again, because that's what I do here. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Patrons, it is time to assemble! Catherine Lambeth, Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen, Bokikio, Eli Bergmoss, Ashlyn Solstice, John Cool, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Chamomile T, Randy Thompson, Wellington Marcus, Boyd Earl, and Marybeth Earl, Stephen Schuhart, Wayne Twitchell, Auntie Kate, 808, Rick Osborne, Dominic Noble, Ish the Mad, Buttoneer, John Steele, Meadow Whisperer, Gavin Robinson, Michael Beam, Munir Amlani, BBD, Jason Knott, Hannah F, Andrew K, Bree Beecher, Jasmine, Sky Skinner, Maeve, Skylar Gray, Flynn Nathan Steele, Tiffany Danger, Sean Piper, Geek Filter, Jane Packard, Wen Dizzle Bizzle. Why do I do this to myself? Sarah Bystem, James Karate, Jacob Tovar, W. Randy, Edie, Mari Neckar, Bush, Celestial Dawn, Din, Mark the Edge, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Lily, Polly Nina, Laura Demo, Liza, Nikki, Gordon, Bloomfield, Andrew, Lama Rose, Zone 1 Librarian, Jenny Mabel, Michael Hardy, and finally, Corey Honkanen and Vale. Done. All right, not my best patron rap, but I figured it would still be fun for you to see all my failure on screen, immortalized in every video this month. Also, I know I mixed Captain America and Superwoman. Deal with it. But thank you, honestly, to all my patrons. I really appreciate all of you, and you really mean a lot to me. I would not be able to do this without you, so thank you. Thank you so much for supporting me being an absolute dork and weirdo. I wish you all the best.